Emily was only 8 years old, yet she had already faced more pain than most people ever could in their entire lives. Her tiny body was weak, and every step she took required effort. The hospital room had become her second home, with its white walls, the faint smell of disinfectant, and the sound of machines that never stopped beeping. The doctors and nurses all knew her by name. Some would walk in and smile just to cheer her up, because despite everything, Emily always managed to smile back. She had a spirit that surprised even the medical staff. She would crack small jokes, talk about her favorite cartoons, and sometimes hum a tune as if to remind herself that she was still a child. But behind those brave eyes was a truth everyone knew. The doctors had told her parents that there was not much time left. Emily's illness was too strong, and nothing they tried seemed to help anymore. Her parents, Sarah and Daniel, lived in constant heartbreak. They stayed by her side day and night, holding her hand, whispering words of love and fighting back tears when they thought she wasn't looking. They prayed, they hoped, but in their hearts they feared the worst. When the doctors finally told them to prepare because their daughter had only a few days left, it felt like the whole world collapsed. But in that quiet storm of sadness, there was one presence who refused to give up. Max, their loyal German shepherd, had been Emily's best friend since the day he arrived as a puppy. From the moment he was brought home, he had attached himself to her. He grew up running around the backyard with her, playing catch and sleeping at the foot of her bed. Over time, he became more than just a pet. He became her guardian, her playmate, and her shadow. Wherever Emily went, Max followed. When Emily's illness grew worse, Max changed too. He no longer ran around like before. Instead, he stayed close to her side, watching her with eyes full of worry. He seemed to understand every movement she made, every sound of pain she tried to hide. Whenever she coughed or winced, Max would lower his head, letting out a soft whine as if he was hurting with her. The hospital allowed Max to visit because everyone had noticed how Emily's face would light up whenever she saw him. Her cheeks would flush with a little more color, her eyes would sparkle, and her smile would return. The nurses even joked that Max was the best medicine Emily ever had. While medicine and machines kept her alive, Max gave her a reason to keep holding on. One evening, after a long and difficult day, Emily lay weakly in bed. Her mother sat beside her, stroking her hair, while her father stood by the window, silently wiping his eyes. Max lay curled at the foot of her bed, his head resting on his paws. The room was quiet except for the slow beeping of the heart monitor. Suddenly, Emily whispered, her voice barely audible, "Max, my hero." Her mother leaned in closer, tears forming in her eyes. She knew how much Max meant to her little girl. Emily reached out her small hand, weak and trembling, and Max immediately lifted his head and placed his warm paw gently in her palm. It was a simple gesture, yet it spoke louder than words. In that moment, Emily was not just a sick child in a hospital bed. She was a little girl comforted by the one friend who never left her side. The doctors who came in that night noticed something unusual. Emily's vital signs, which had been declining steadily, looked slightly stronger whenever Max was near. At first, they thought it was just coincidence, but soon they began to realize it happened often. When Max sat beside her bed, her heartbeat seemed steadier. When he rested his head on her chest, her breathing slowed into a calmer rhythm. Her parents noticed it too. Daniel whispered to Sarah, "Look at her numbers. Whenever he's near, she gets better." Sarah nodded, wiping her tears, but deep down she knew it was true. It wasn't medicine. It wasn't machines. It was love, the unconditional, pure love between a child and her dog. Still, the reality was harsh. The doctors had said she had days left. Everyone braced themselves for the inevitable, but Max refused to accept it. He became restless when anyone tried to move him away from Emily's bed. He barked softly at nurses if they blocked his view. He refused food and water unless Emily herself touched him. It was as if his entire world had narrowed down to one mission: stay with her, protect her, and not let her go. That night, as Sarah drifted into an uneasy sleep on the chair beside the bed, she awoke to find Max still wide awake, his eyes fixed on Emily, watching her chest rise and fall. He hadn't moved for hours, yet he looked alert, almost as though he was guarding her against something only he could see. Sarah whispered softly, "You're our angel, Max." The nurses, too, were touched. Some of them admitted they had never seen such loyalty in an animal. One of them said, "I've worked here for 15 years, but this is different. This dog knows more than we do." Even the doctors, usually so serious and professional, couldn't help but smile when they saw the bond between Emily and Max. As the days passed, Emily grew weaker, but she never let go of Max. Whenever she was awake, she would talk to him in a soft voice, telling him about the games they would play once she got better. Even though everyone else had lost hope, Max listened with full attention, tilting his head, wagging his tail softly as though he believed every word. In the stillness of that hospital room, something extraordinary was unfolding. While the world outside moved on, inside that little space a battle was being fought, not with drugs or surgeries, but with loyalty, love, and the unspoken connection between a little girl and her dog. And though the doctors had given up, Max had not. In his heart there was no room for despair. He believed, and somehow that belief began to show itself in Emily's fragile body. The next morning was heavy with silence. Emily's parents had barely slept. They had taken turns watching over their little girl, listening to her shallow breaths, holding her hands when she stirred, and whispering words of love into her ears. The doctors had already said she might not make it through the week, and each hour felt like a fragile gift slipping away too quickly. The nurses walked softly in the hallway, their eyes kind but full of sympathy. Everyone in that hospital wing knew Emily's case, but in the middle of all that sadness, Max was restless. He had not left Emily's side since the night before. He lay curled against her, his fur brushing her thin arm, his ears twitching at every sound she made. His eyes were open even when the rest of the room was asleep. The staff noticed that he wasn't just lying there. He was watching, guarding, and waiting as if he sensed something more important than any of them could understand. When the first doctor came in to check Emily that morning, he frowned at the monitors. The numbers were low, her pulse was faint, her oxygen levels dropping. "She's slipping," he whispered softly to Sarah and Daniel, trying to prepare them. Sarah clutched Emily's hand tighter, tears spilling down her face. Daniel stood stiffly by the window, his fists clenched in helplessness. They both knew what the words meant, but their hearts were not ready. How could a parent ever be ready? Emily stirred and opened her tired eyes just a little. She saw Max lying beside her and gave him the weakest of smiles. "Max," she whispered. Her voice was so soft it was almost like a sigh. Max's ears perked and he immediately lifted his head, pressing his nose gently against her cheek. Her hand, small and fragile, reached out to touch his fur. The monitor beside her bed gave a sudden, stronger beep. The nurse gasped. Sarah's eyes widened as she looked at the numbers. Emily's pulse, which had been faint just moments ago, was suddenly steadier. Her oxygen levels began to climb slowly. The doctor adjusted his glasses, staring at the monitor in disbelief. "That's unusual," he muttered. "She was deteriorating, but now, look." He pointed at the screen, and even Daniel turned from the window in shock. The change was undeniable. As Max nuzzled closer, Emily's breathing grew more even. She coughed once weakly, then closed her eyes again, but her chest rose with a steadier rhythm. The nurse whispered, "It's like he's calming her body down." Another nurse entered and stood frozen, watching the sight. None of them could explain it, but they all felt the same thing. Something was happening that went beyond medical science. The room filled with quiet awe. Sarah stroked Emily's hair, whispering, "Stay with us, baby." Daniel knelt beside Max, rubbing his ears, whispering in a trembling voice, "Don't leave her, boy. Don't let her go." Max wagged his tail faintly, as if he understood the plea. From that moment, the staff began to notice a pattern. Whenever Max was present, Emily's condition seemed to stabilize. If he rested his head on her chest, her heartbeat grew stronger. If he placed his paw lightly on her arm, her blood pressure steadied. When he licked her hand gently, she would open her eyes, smile, and whisper his name. It was as if his love was flowing directly into her, giving her body the strength it had almost lost. Word began to spread quietly among the hospital staff. Some of them, who were not assigned to Emily's ward, slipped in just to see for themselves. They would stand silently at the door, watching the little girl and her dog, tears welling in their eyes. One nurse said softly, "I've seen machines save lives, but never a dog," another whispered. "This is something divine." By the afternoon, Emily seemed a little more awake. Her cheeks, once pale, held a hint of color. She even asked for a sip of water, something she hadn't done in days. Her parents looked at each other, their faces a mixture of relief and disbelief. The doctor on duty couldn't explain it. He adjusted her medications, checked her charts, and shook his head. "There's no reason for this," he admitted. "She was supposed to be declining, but her body, it's holding on." Emily's parents knew the reason. They saw it in Max's steady eyes and in Emily's gentle smile every time she touched his fur. Sarah kissed the top of Emily's head and whispered, "He's your miracle." That night, as the hospital grew quiet and most of the lights dimmed, Max remained alert. Emily fell into a deeper sleep, her hand resting on his thick fur. Every so often she would stir, whimper in pain, and Max would instantly react. He would place his paw gently on her arm or nuzzle her hand. Almost immediately, the monitors would show improvement again. It became so consistent that even the night nurse stopped taking notes for a moment and simply stood watching with tears in her eyes. When morning came, Emily's condition had not worsened. In fact, she was slightly stronger than the day before. The doctors exchanged confused looks, whispering to one another in the hallway. One of them finally said, "I don't understand it, but whatever that dog is doing, let him keep doing it." Emily's room slowly turned into a place of hope. Other parents who were struggling with their own sick children heard about her and came to peek inside. They saw a fragile little girl lying in bed, holding on to life with the help of a loyal German shepherd, and they found themselves crying too. Some of them prayed silently outside her door, asking for the same kind of miracle in their own lives. Emily herself seemed to sense the change. When she opened her eyes and found her parents and Max nearby, she whispered, "I'm not scared." Sarah kissed her hand, trying to smile through her tears, and Daniel squeezed her little fingers. Max wagged his tail, leaning in close as if to agree. The doctors still reminded the family to be cautious. They said her illness was still severe, and there was no guarantee of recovery. But deep inside, Sarah and Daniel felt something they had not felt in weeks. Hope. For the first time, they believed their daughter might not be leaving them so soon. And all of it was because of Max. That night, as the sky outside the hospital turned dark and stars began to shine, Emily whispered again with her eyes half closed, "Promise me, Max, you won't leave me." Her words were soft, but Max heard every syllable. He pressed his head against her chest, his heartbeat steady, strong, and sure. The monitors responded once more, beeping in rhythm with the bond between a little girl and her dog. The news of Emily and Max began to travel quietly through the hospital. At first, it was just the nurses whispering about the unusual improvement in her condition. Then the doctors, who had been expecting the worst, started to watch her more carefully, taking note of every small change that happened when Max was present. Before long, even people who had nothing to do with her case came to see the little girl who was fighting against all odds with the help of her loyal German shepherd. Emily herself was becoming a symbol of hope. Her condition was still fragile, but there was something in her eyes now that hadn't been there for weeks. There was life, a small spark of determination that grew brighter whenever Max was near. She still had pain, still grew tired quickly, but instead of drifting away, she began to talk more, smile more, and even ask questions about the world outside her hospital window. One morning, a nurse brought in a coloring book, and Emily surprised everyone by sitting up with Max's help. She leaned against his warm body, holding her crayons with weak fingers, and began to color. It wasn't much, and her strokes were shaky, but it was the first time in days that she had done something playful. The nurse wiped her eyes quietly, while Sarah and Daniel watched their daughter in amazement. "Look at her," Sarah whispered, her voice trembling with joy. "She hasn't had the strength to do this in weeks." Daniel nodded, squeezing his wife's hand, unable to speak. They both knew it was because of Max. He stayed perfectly still as Emily leaned against him, his big body acting like a steady cushion for her. He didn't move, didn't complain, and didn't even look away. His eyes were on her the whole time, as though guarding her every breath. The hospital staff began to study this bond more closely. Some said it was emotional strength keeping Emily alive. Others believed it was a physical response. Perhaps the comfort of Max's presence was lowering her stress and stabilizing her body. A senior doctor, however, admitted softly, "Science doesn't explain everything. Sometimes there are things beyond what we can measure." As the days passed, Emily's improvement became more noticeable. She started eating small portions of food again. Her laughter, faint but genuine, returned when Max nudged her with his nose or pushed a toy toward her bed. Nurses would often stop by her room on their breaks pretending to check equipment, but really just to catch a glimpse of her smile. One of them whispered, "I come here because this room gives me hope. Every time I see her, I remember why I became a nurse." Emily's parents were overwhelmed with emotions. They had prepared themselves for the worst, but now they were daring to hope again. Sarah spent long hours watching Emily and Max together, marveling at how her daughter's face changed whenever she stroked his fur. Daniel began keeping a small notebook, writing down every improvement, every little sign of progress, as if he wanted to capture the miracle in words. One afternoon, something happened that left everyone speechless. Emily, who had been too weak to stand for weeks, suddenly asked to sit at the edge of the bed. With Max standing tall beside her, she slowly slid her feet down until they touched the floor. Her legs trembled and Sarah rushed forward to help, but Emily shook her head softly. She leaned against Max, gripping his collar gently, and with his steady support she stood up. It lasted only a few seconds before she had to sit again, but in that moment the entire room filled with tears and applause. Daniel dropped to his knees and hugged Max tightly. "You're doing what none of us could," he whispered into the dog's ear. Sarah buried her face in her hands, crying tears of joy. Even the doctor, who had come in for a routine check, stood frozen, unable to hide his astonishment. This shouldn't be possible," he said softly. The story of that moment spread quickly. Soon, other families in the hospital began visiting Emily's room. They came with their own struggles and their own sick children, but when they saw Emily with Max, their eyes lit up with hope. Some parents prayed in silence at her door. Some asked to pet Max, believing maybe a touch of his fur carried the same strength. Emily, though still weak, loved the visitors. She would smile shyly and whisper greetings, and Max, always gentle, would wag his tail and allow anyone to stroke him. The bond between the girl and her dog was no longer just helping her. It was inspiring an entire ward. But the most touching moments happened when Emily and Max were alone together. At night, when the lights were dim and her parents finally drifted into exhausted sleep, Emily would whisper to Max about her dreams. "When I get better, I'll take you to the park again," she would say softly. "We'll play fetch and you'll chase the ball like you always did." Max would respond with a low, comforting sound, resting his head on her chest, his eyes never closing. The nurses overheard these whispers sometimes and would wipe their tears quietly. "She believes she will live," one said, and maybe that belief is what's saving her. The hospital began to adjust its routine to allow Max more access. He was given a special badge that allowed him to stay in her room all the time. The staff even brought him water bowls and food trays, though he rarely touched his meals unless Emily encouraged him. His devotion was absolute. He refused to leave even for a moment, as if he knew his presence was the thin line between life and death. One evening, as the sun set and painted the sky outside with shades of orange and pink, Emily sat up in bed with Max beside her. She reached out her small hand, stroking his ear, and whispered, "You're my hero, Max. Don't let me go." Max wagged his tail softly, his gaze fixed on her as though promising he never would. Sarah and Daniel, standing nearby, exchanged a glance filled with both wonder and gratitude. Sarah whispered, "Maybe we were wrong to give up. Maybe there's still hope." Daniel nodded, his eyes wet with tears, replying softly, "He won't let her go, not while he's here." The days that followed were filled with small victories. Emily ate more. She talked more. She even laughed at silly jokes her father made, something she hadn't done in weeks. And every time Max was there, silent, watchful, and full of love. Doctors continued to run tests, but none of them could explain what was happening. Her illness had not vanished, but it was no longer winning. "It's like she found new strength," one doctor said during a meeting. "But we don't know where it's coming from." Another replied quietly, "We do. Look at the dog. He's her medicine. What began as a hopeless case was slowly turning into a story that touched everyone in the building. Emily's room, once heavy with sorrow, was now filled with light and warmth. It wasn't only because of machines or medicine. It was because of the bond between a little girl and her German shepherd, a bond so strong that it gave even the doctors reason to believe in miracles. The hospital had never felt this way before. What was once a place filled mostly with worry, heavy footsteps, and quiet tears now carried something different. Emily's room had become the heart of hope. Nurses, doctors, and even families of other patients came by whenever they could, drawn to the miracle they saw unfolding. A little girl who had been given only days to live was slowly finding her way back, and everyone knew it was because of Max. The German shepherd had become more than just a pet. People whispered about him in the hallways as though he were something magical. Some called him an angel in disguise. Others said he had a gift. Whatever it was, no one could deny that Emily's body responded to him in ways that medicine could not explain. One morning, Emily's doctor walked in with her chart, expecting the usual signs of decline. But instead he froze. The latest test showed improvement he had never seen in a case like hers. Her heart was stronger, her organs were functioning better, and her blood levels were stabilizing. He looked at the numbers again and again, shaking his head. "This doesn't happen," he whispered under his breath. "Not at this stage." Sarah noticed his expression and asked, her voice trembling with both fear and hope. "What is it, doctor? Is she worse?" The doctor looked up, his eyes wide. "No, quite the opposite. She's getting better. Much better." For a moment the room was silent. Then Sarah's hands flew to her mouth, tears spilling over. Daniel gripped the edge of the bed, his knuckles turning white as he whispered, "Thank God." Emily, who had been quietly listening, turned her head toward Max and smiled. "I told you," she whispered softly. "He's my hero." The news spread quickly. Other doctors gathered around, studying her results, comparing notes, and checking her in person. Some were skeptical, but none could deny the evidence. Emily was recovering, and there was no medical explanation. The only difference in her treatment had been Max. As the days passed, the changes became even more obvious. Emily began sitting up longer, asking for food, and even playing small games with her parents. She would toss a little ball gently toward Max, and though her throw was weak, he would carefully bring it back, placing it gently on her lap. Each laugh that came out of her mouth felt like a victory, and the nurses often wiped their eyes at the sight. Max, on the other hand, seemed to know exactly what was happening. He walked around with quiet confidence, staying close to Emily but also looking out at anyone who entered the room. It was as though he understood that this was his mission, and he would not stop until it was complete. One evening, the hospital staff gathered in Emily's room to witness what they could hardly believe. She had asked to try walking again. With Max standing proudly at her side, Emily swung her legs slowly over the edge of the bed. Her parents stood on either side, nervous but hopeful. Max pressed close, steady and strong, letting her hold onto his collar. Step by step, she began to move across the room. Her legs shook and her breaths were shallow, but she walked. The nurses clapped softly, tears streaming down their cheeks. Sarah sobbed openly, holding on to Daniel as they watched their little girl take steps they never thought she would take again. Even the doctor, a man usually calm and serious, had to wipe his glasses to hide the mist in his eyes. Emily reached the window, leaned against Max, and whispered, "I made it." Max wagged his tail, licking her hand proudly, and everyone in the room felt the weight of that moment. From that day on, Emily's room became a place of celebration. Each morning brought a new improvement. Her body was still fragile, but her spirit was strong, and Max's presence gave her the courage to push herself a little more each day. Her parents no longer sat in silence waiting for the worst. Instead, they laughed with her, told stories, and even planned for the future. But what touched everyone the most was the way the doctors reacted. Many of them admitted they had no explanation for her recovery. "Sometimes medicine is not enough," one said quietly. "Sometimes it takes something we cannot measure." Another, who had been in the field for decades, confessed, "In all my years, I've never seen anything like this. That dog is saving her life." Even outside the hospital, the story began to spread. Visitors who came to see their own loved ones would hear about the little girl and her dog and stop by her door. Some would pray, some would just stand quietly in awe, and some would leave with renewed strength for their own battles. Emily's story became more than just her own. It became a beacon of hope for many. One night, after a long day filled with visitors, Emily lay in bed with Max beside her as always. She looked at him with tired but happy eyes and whispered, "Thank you for not leaving me." Max pressed his head against her chest, his warm breath steady and calm. Sarah, who was sitting nearby, heard the words and wiped away a tear. She knew her daughter's life had been extended because of this bond, a bond no human could have created. As weeks passed, the impossible became undeniable. Emily was no longer a child waiting to say goodbye. She was a child slowly returning to life. The doctors changed their notes, moving from end-of-life care to monitoring recovery. Nurses who had once walked into her room with heavy hearts now entered with smiles, eager to see what new miracle awaited them. And through it all, Max remained the same, loyal, protective, and unwavering. He had carried her through the darkest days, refusing to let go, and now he walked beside her as she took her first steps back into life. The day the doctor finally told Sarah and Daniel that Emily was no longer critical, but stable, the entire ward cheered. Some hugged each other, some clapped, and others simply stood in silence, wiping their eyes. Sarah hugged Emily tightly, whispering over and over, "You're our miracle." Daniel hugged Max, burying his face in the dog's fur as he whispered, "You saved her." Max stood tall, wagging his tail, his eyes calm and proud. He didn't need words. He had done what no one thought possible. And in that hospital, even the doctors cried, not because of loss, but because they had witnessed something far greater than medicine. They had seen the power of love, loyalty, and the unbreakable bond between a little girl and her dog. Months had passed since the day doctors had prepared Emily's parents for the worst. The memory of those words still lingered in their minds, but it no longer carried the same weight. The little girl who once had only days left was now walking, laughing, and planning a future. And the one who had stood beside her through it all without a single doubt or hesitation was Max, her German shepherd. Life at home was very different from the hospital. Emily no longer spent her days surrounded by machines and doctors. Instead, she woke up to the gentle sunlight streaming through her bedroom window and the sound of Max's tail thumping against the floor as soon as he saw her stir. He would jump up on her bed, lick her face gently, and remind her that he was still her guardian. Her parents could hardly believe the transformation. Sarah often stood by the kitchen counter, watching Emily and Max play in the living room, and tears would fill her eyes. Daniel sometimes sat quietly in the garden, shaking his head in disbelief. "We almost lost her," he would whisper. "But look at her now." Emily herself had changed too. She was still a little weak, and her body needed time to fully recover, but her spirit was unstoppable. She wanted to do everything she had missed during her long stay in the hospital. She wanted to ride her bicycle again, paint pictures, play board games, and run in the park. And every single thing she did, Max was right there, never letting her out of his sight. The bond between them had grown even stronger. Emily often talked to Max as though he understood every word. "You saved me," she would whisper, hugging him tightly. "I'll never forget." Max would simply wag his tail, his eyes filled with the same loyalty he had always shown. What amazed everyone the most was how the doctors themselves reacted whenever they saw Emily for her checkups. Each time her parents brought her back for tests, the doctors would gather around in astonishment. Her health was improving steadily. Her organs, once failing, were functioning better than expected. Her heart was stronger, and her body was healing in ways no one could explain. One of the doctors finally admitted, "We can't explain this with science alone." Yes, medicine helped, but what truly saved her was her will to live, and that will came from Max. Another nodded and added softly, "Sometimes love does what medicine cannot." The hospital staff, who had once cried quietly outside her room fearing she wouldn't make it, now cried tears of joy. Nurses who had cared for her visited occasionally just to see her walking and laughing. They would kneel down, pet Max, and say, "Good boy. You're the reason we get to see this smile." Emily's story began to spread beyond the hospital. Local newspapers wrote about her. A journalist came to interview Sarah and Daniel, and they shared the details of the miracle they had witnessed. Soon, people all over the community knew about the little girl and her German shepherd, who had beaten the odds. Letters poured in from strangers who said they had cried reading her story. Some said it gave them hope for their own battles. Others simply thanked Emily and Max for reminding the world about the power of love. Emily, however, didn't think of herself as a hero. Whenever someone praised her, she would shake her head and point at Max, He's the hero, she would say firmly. I just followed him. One day her school invited her back for a short visit. Her classmates hadn't seen her for months, and many of them didn't know if she would ever return. When she walked into the classroom, holding Max's leash, the entire room erupted in cheers. Children rushed forward to hug her, and Max stood tall, protecting her gently while wagging his tail. Emily laughed, her cheeks glowing with happiness. It was a moment that no one in that classroom would ever forget. At night, when things were quiet again, Emily often lay in bed with Max curled at her feet. She would think about those dark days when everyone thought she would not survive. She remembered the sadness in her parents' eyes, the whispers of the nurses and the tears of the doctors, and she remembered how Max never left her, not even for a second. "You never gave up on me," she whispered once, pressing her cheek against his fur. "Even when I wanted to close my eyes forever, you kept me here." Her parents heard those whispers sometimes, and their hearts broke and healed at the same time. They knew the truth. They had seen how Max's presence changed everything, how he brought life back into their daughter's frail body, how he made even the doctors cry with wonder. Seasons changed, and Emily grew stronger. She began attending school again, playing with her friends and running in the park with Max. She still needed regular checkups, and her body carried scars of her illness, but her spirit was free. Everywhere she went, Max followed. People in the neighborhood recognized them instantly. Some would wave, others would smile, and many would whisper, "That's the little girl who lived because of her dog." One afternoon, as Emily played in the park, Sarah sat on a bench, watching her daughter throw a ball for Max. She felt Daniel sit beside her and slip his hand into hers. They watched together as Emily laughed, her hair blowing in the wind, her dog racing after the ball with all the joy in the world. "She was supposed to be gone by now," Daniel said softly, his voice full of awe. "But instead she's right here, stronger than ever." Sarah leaned against him, tears filling her eyes. "Max saved her," she whispered. "I don't care what anyone says. He gave her life." That evening, as the family sat together at the dinner table, Emily looked at her parents seriously and said, "When I grow up, I want to help people. I want to be like the doctors and nurses who helped me. But I also want to show everyone that love is the best medicine." Max wagged his tail under the table as if to agree. Years later, Emily would carry that promise with her. But for now, she was just a little girl, grateful for every new day, and thankful for her loyal dog who had stood between her and death. The memory of those dark hospital nights would never fade, but neither would the miracle. And whenever her parents thought about it, they remembered the moment even the doctors cried, not out of despair but out of joy, humbled by a bond that medicine could not explain. Max never asked for praise. He never needed words. His reward was simple, the sight of Emily running, laughing, and living. Every wag of his tail, every proud stance, every gentle nuzzle said the same thing. He had done what he was meant to do. And so the story of Emily and Max lived on, not just in their home, but in the hearts of everyone who had heard it. It was a reminder that miracles come in many forms, and sometimes they walk on four legs, with eyes full of love and a heart full of loyalty, strong enough to change the course of a little girl's life.